The autumn wind carried laughter through Timber Hollow, but not the kind that warmed hearts. Judith Brennan wiped the sweat from her brow as she hauled another armload of bricks to the side of her small cabin. Her heavy frame made the work exhausting, but she persisted, ignoring the voices drifting from the main street. "Look at her," called out Marcus Thornfield, the town's wealthiest merchant, leaning against the post of his grand store. "One chimney ain't enough for all that smoke, I reckon. Needs two just to keep from suffocating herself." The cluster of men around him erupted in cruel guffaws. Even some of the women joining them for afternoon gossip covered their mouths to hide smirks. Judith's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes down, focusing on the worn sketch in her other hand, her father's final gift to her. Thomas Brennan had been Timber Hollow's blacksmith, a man whose mind worked as skillfully as his hands. Before the smoke-induced pneumonia took him 3 winters ago, he'd spent his final lucid days scratching designs on scraps of paper, trying to solve a problem that haunted him. Why did their cabin fill with choking smoke while the fire burned, when other homes seemed fine? "The heat rises, Judy girl," he'd rasped, his lungs struggling. "But the cold air pushes down. They fight each other in a single chimney. 2 chimneys, 2 paths. The smoke finds its way out faster, less fighting, more flowing." She hadn't understood all his words then. She understood even less of the physics behind them now. But she understood love and duty and the weight of a promise made to a dying father. "I'll prove you right, Papa," she whispered to herself, setting another brick. Even if they never stop laughing. By mid-October, her second chimney stood beside the first, crooked perhaps, built by inexperienced hands, but standing nonetheless. She'd carved small channels between them, following her father's sketch as best she could interpret it. When she lit her first fire of the season, something remarkable happened. The smoke drew up faster, cleaner. Her cabin grew warm without becoming suffocating. The air felt different, lighter somehow. But no one came to see. They only came to mock. "Judith's building a second home for all her second helpings," yelled Billy Crawford, the butcher's son, as he passed with his friends. Even Pastor Williams, normally a kind man, shook his head with pity rather than curiosity. "Bless her heart, she's doing her best," he told his wife, as if Judith were a simple child playing in mud. The worst came from Thornfield himself. One evening, as Judith walked to the general store for supplies, he stepped directly into her path, his daughter Emma, a beautiful girl who'd once been Judith's friend before social pressures drove them apart, standing uncomfortably behind him. "Tell me, Miss Brennan," Thornfield said loudly, ensuring everyone on the street could hear, "does having 2 chimneys make you feel twice as important, or does it just take twice the wood to heat all that space?" He gestured vaguely at her body, and the crowd's laughter felt like stones pelting her skin. Emma looked away, ashamed but silent. Judith pushed past without a word, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Don't argue with fools, Judy girl. Let your work speak for itself." November arrived with unusual ferocity. Old-timers called it the Devil's Breath winter, remembering a similar cold snap from 30 years prior that had claimed lives. Snow fell thick and constant, and temperatures plummeted to depths that made even the hardiest mountain men retreat to their shelters. Every home in Timber Hollow kept their fires burning day and night. The town became a forest of smoke plumes, each chimney coughing gray columns into the heavy air. But as the weeks wore on, something began to go wrong. The smoke wasn't rising properly. Years of neglect, improperly built chimneys, and the unusual weather patterns created a deadly combination. The heavy cold air seemed to push down on the warm smoke, forcing it back into homes through every crack and gap. Families woke coughing. Children developed persistent rattling coughs. The elderly struggled to breathe. The first near tragedy came in late November. Samuel and Martha Henderson, a couple in their 70s who lived in a cabin at the edge of town, nearly died in their sleep. Martha had sealed every gap against the cold, not realizing she was trapping the smoke inside. Their daughter found them unconscious beside their cheerfully burning fire, the room thick with a gray haze. Doc Reynolds worked for hours to revive them, forcing them to breathe fresh air, slapping their faces, even resorting to the old method of holding ammonia salts under their noses. When they finally gasped back to consciousness, the entire town gathered outside the doc's office, shaken. "We've got a problem," Doc Reynolds announced grimly. "This cold's not breaking anytime soon, and our chimneys can't handle it. Someone's going to die if we don't figure something out." But what could they do? The ground was frozen too hard to rebuild foundations. Supplies for proper reconstruction wouldn't arrive until spring. They were trapped in their smoky homes, choosing between freezing to death or suffocating slowly. It was during this crisis that Orrin Blackwood came down from his mountain camp. Orrin was what folks called a mountain man, one of those solitary souls who preferred the company of peaks and pines to people. He was a tracker, hunter, and trader, someone who understood the language of wind and weather better than he understood town gossip. His visits to Timber Hollow were infrequent, usually just to trade pelts and resupply before vanishing back into the high country. But this winter, he noticed something strange. From his vantage point on the mountainside, he could see the entire town sprawled in the valley below. Most days now, it looked like a cauldron of smoke, thick gray clouds hanging low over the rooftops, barely rising. It reminded him of the way a dying fire smolders, all smoke, no flame, suffocating itself, except for one spot. One cabin at the south edge of town had two smoke columns rising clean and straight, piercing through the heavy air like twin arrows. Curiosity drew him down. When Orrin asked at the general store whose cabin that was, Mrs. Patterson, one of the few who treated Judith with basic decency, pointed sadly toward the south. "That's the Brennan place. Poor Judith lives there alone since her father passed, built herself a second chimney this fall, and the whole town made sport of her for it." Orrin filed that information away and went to see for himself. Judith was carrying firewood when she noticed the tall stranger approaching her cabin. Mountain men were easy to spot. They moved differently than town folk, with a quiet confidence that came from self-reliance. This one was tall and lean, with weathered features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Ma'am," he said, removing his fur hat, "name's Orrin Blackwood. I've been watching the smoke patterns from up high, and I got to say, your setup here is different. Mind if I ask you about it?" Judith's first instinct was suspicion. Was this another person come to mock her? But his tone held genuine curiosity, not ridicule. She found herself answering. "It was my father's idea," she said quietly. "He was a blacksmith, always thinking about how fire and air work. Before he died, he sketched this out, said 2 chimneys would help the smoke escape better." "Can I see the sketch?" She hesitated, then fetched the worn paper from inside. Orrin studied it carefully, his eyes narrowing in concentration. Then he looked up at her 2 chimneys, at the small channels she'd carved between them, and back at the sketch. "Your father was a smart man," Orrin said finally. "He understood something most folks don't. Hot air rises, but it needs cold air to push it up. 1 chimney, everything fights. 2 chimneys with connections. You've created a system. The cold air from one helps push the hot smoke up the other, and they trade back and forth." "Does it really work?" Judith asked, startled to hear someone explain what she'd only felt. "Let me show you something." Orrin walked to the edge of her property, where they could see most of Timber Hollow spread below. "Look at the smoke from other houses. See how it's thick, low, almost seems to be sinking back down? That's because the cold air is winning the fight, pushing the smoke back into the homes. Now look at yours. Straight up, clean, fast. You're not fighting the cold, you're using it." For the first time in months, Judith felt something other than shame about her 2 chimneys. She felt a flicker of pride. "The thing is," Orrin continued, his expression growing serious, "the rest of this town is in trouble. You hear about the Hendersons almost dying?" She nodded. "Won't be the last. This cold's settling in for the long haul, and people's chimneys can't handle it, but yours can." He turned to face her directly. "You could help them." Judith laughed bitterly. "They wouldn't listen to me. They think I'm a fool." "Then we'll make them listen." Orrin's plan was simple, but required patience neither of them truly had. He wanted to document the difference, gather evidence, and present it to the town council rationally. But fate had other plans. 3 nights later, young Emma Thornfield woke to her brother's screaming. Little James, only 6 years old, was coughing violently, his lips tinged blue in the lamplight. Their grand house, despite Marcus Thornfield's wealth, had a chimney built more for show than function. Tall, yes, but narrow, and with several bends that looked elegant but trapped smoke. Emma ran for Doc Reynolds, who came immediately but could do little beyond getting the boy outside into the freezing air. Marcus Thornfield, the man who'd mocked Judith so cruelly, stood in his nightshirt watching his son struggle to breathe, terror replacing his usual arrogance. Orrin was there too. He'd been bunking at the boarding house and heard the commotion. He took one look at the Thornfield chimney and made a decision. "Miss Brennan," he said, arriving at Judith's cabin before dawn and pounding on her door. "I need you, now." They reached the Thornfield house just as dawn broke. Marcus stood on his porch, his face haggard. When he saw Judith, something complicated passed over his features. Shame, anger, desperation, all mixed together. "Come to gloat?" he asked quietly. "No," Judith said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I came to help." She studied the chimney, then the way the smoke was behaving. Using her father's principles and her own hard-won experience, she diagnosed the problem. The chimney was too narrow and had too many bends. The smoke was backing up, especially in the intense cold. "You need to temporarily modify the draw," she explained. "Open the upper windows on the opposite side of the house from the chimney. Create a cross-draft. It won't fix everything, but it'll help until we can rebuild." "And then?" Marcus asked. Judith took a breath. "Then you need a second chimney, or a complete rebuild of this one, but that's months of work." Marcus Thornfield, proud, wealthy, cruel Marcus Thornfield, looked at his son being tended by Doc Reynolds, still coughing. Then he looked at Judith. "If you can save my son, I'll build 10 chimneys exactly how you tell me." Word of Judith helping the Thornfields spread like wildfire through Timber Hollow. Suddenly, the woman they'd mocked was the only one who understood what was killing them slowly. Orrin seized the opportunity. He called a town meeting at the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone, and with enough fireplaces to keep warm. When people gathered, skeptical and desperate in equal measure, Orrin stood before them with Judith at his side. "Show of hands," he began. "Who's had someone in their family get sick from smoke this winter?" Nearly every hand rose. "Who's woken up coughing?" More hands. "Who's scared their children might not make it to spring if this keeps up?" The silence was answer enough. "Then listen to this woman," Orrin said firmly. "She's not a fool. She's not crazy. She's someone who learned from a father who understood fire and air better than any of us. And she's willing to help every single person in this town survive this winter, despite how you've treated her." Judith stepped forward, her heart hammering. She wasn't used to public speaking, wasn't used to people actually listening, but she thought of her father, of the Hendersons nearly dying, of little James Thornfield struggling to breathe. "I can't rebuild all your chimneys before spring," she said honestly. "But I can show you how to improve what you have, how to create better draw, where to open vents, how to position your fires. My father taught me that fire isn't your enemy, trapped smoke is, and smoke can be managed." The questions came fast then. Why did smoke sometimes go up and sometimes sink? Why were some homes worse than others? Could they really fix this without tearing everything down? Judith answered what she could, and what she couldn't answer with certainty, she admitted freely. Her honesty, more than anything, won them over. She wasn't pretending to know everything. She was sharing what she'd learned through trial and painful error. Pastor Williams stood up. "I propose we let Miss Brennan survey every home in Timber Hollow. Let her tell us what needs fixing most urgently, and I propose we pay her for her time and expertise." "She can start with my house," Marcus Thornfield announced, standing with difficulty, his pride clearly wounded but his love for his son stronger. "And I'll fund materials for any family that can't afford fixes." It wasn't quite an apology, but Judith recognized it as the closest thing to one she'd likely get. She nodded acceptance. What followed were the most exhausting and exhilarating months of Judith's life. With Orrin at her side, he insisted on helping, saying he had nothing better to do than make sure this town doesn't suffocate itself. She went from house to house. Some fixes were simple: opening a vent here, adjusting a damper there, teaching people how to arrange their fires for better draw. Others were more complex, requiring temporary structural modifications, using whatever materials they had on hand. The worst cases needed what Judith called sister chimneys, smaller secondary shafts connected to the main chimney that helped balance the air pressure. They weren't as elegant as her father's original design, but they worked. Judith discovered she had a talent for this work. Each chimney was different, each home presented unique challenges, and she found herself developing an intuition for how air would move in a space. She could walk into a room, feel the draft, observe the smoke patterns, and diagnose the problem within minutes. Orrin proved invaluable. His strength made the physical labor easier, but more than that, his presence lent her authority. When people started to question or doubt, Orrin's quiet, "I'd listen to her if I were you," usually settled the matter. He had the respect that came from being a man who survived alone in the mountains. If he trusted Judith's knowledge, others felt they could too. They worked from dawn until well after dark, sometimes by lamplight, racing against the cold. And slowly, Timber Hollow transformed. The thick blanket of smoke that had hung over the town began to clear. Families reported sleeping better, coughing less. Children's color improved. The elderly breathed easier, but it wasn't just chimneys that were being rebuilt. Something else was happening between Judith and Orrin. At first, their conversations were purely practical, discussing draw ratios, ventilation, the properties of different wood smoke. But as days turned into weeks, working side by side in the bitter cold, things shifted. Orrin told her about life in the mountains, about tracking elk through deep snow, about nights spent alone under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He spoke of loneliness too, the kind that came from choosing solitude because people had always seemed more complicated than necessary. "Up there," he said one evening as they warmed their hands by a fire they'd just fixed, "everything makes sense. Wind blows, snow falls, animals hunt or hide. It's simple, clean." "And down here?" Judith asked. "Down here people laugh at a woman for building a second chimney, even when she's trying to save their lives." He looked at her directly. "I never understood why folks are so cruel to things they don't understand." Judith felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the fire. "You're not like most people." "Neither are you," Orrin said quietly. "Most people would have told this town to freeze in the dark after how they treated you, but here you are, helping every last one of them." "What else would I do?" Judith asked, genuinely puzzled. "Let them die because their pride hurt my feelings?" "That's why you're remarkable." The word hung between them like a gift neither knew quite how to receive. Remarkable. When had anyone ever called Judith remarkable? Their first kiss happened in the most unromantic setting imaginable, inside the Petersons' attic, both covered in soot, their breath fogging in the freezing air as they worked to clear a blocked flue. They'd succeeded finally, smoke suddenly drawing up properly, and in their triumphant relief they'd turned to each other and simply connected. It was brief, almost accidental, both pulling back with surprised expressions. But then Orrin smiled, really smiled, something Judith realized she'd never quite seen before, and said, "Well, that was better than any mountain sunrise I've ever seen." Judith laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so foreign to her own ears that she laughed harder. Soon they were both laughing like children, giddy with more than just their chimney victory. After that, things changed. Orrin started finding excuses to hold her hand as they walked between houses. Judith caught herself watching him work, admiring the efficient grace of his movements. They stole moments when they could, a quick embrace in an empty barn, whispered conversations as they walked home under winter stars. The town noticed, of course. Timber Hollow noticed everything. But now the gossip had changed its tone. "Never thought I'd see Orrin Blackwood settle for anyone," Mrs. Patterson remarked to her husband. "But I suppose it takes a special woman to catch a mountain man's eye." Even Marcus Thornfield, monitoring his recovering son, commented to his wife, "That Brennan woman has more substance than I credited her for. And Blackwood's no fool. If he sees something in her, it's real." Emma Thornfield, who'd avoided Judith all season out of shame for her father's cruelty, finally approached her one afternoon. "Judith," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for not standing up for you, for letting my father—" "Emma," Judith interrupted gently, "you don't have to apologize for someone else's choices." "But I could have chosen differently," Emma insisted. "I could have been your friend instead of—" She gestured helplessly. Judith surprised herself by pulling Emma into a brief hug. "You're choosing now, that's what matters." By January, Judith and Orrin were inseparable. He'd given up his mountain camp temporarily, taking a room at the boarding house so he could spend his days helping her. At night, they'd often sit in her cabin, the one with 2 perfect chimneys, talking until the fire burned low. "What happens when spring comes?" Judith asked one night, the question she'd been avoiding. Orrin was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "I've been thinking, what if I didn't go back? To the mountains? What if," he continued carefully, "I stayed here with you? We could, I don't know, maybe start some kind of proper business. You'd design better heating systems. I'd help build them. Plenty of towns out here could use what you know." Judith's heart hammered. "You'd give up the mountains for me?" "I'd give up the mountains for this," Orrin corrected, gesturing between them. "For someone who sees me, really sees me, who doesn't need me to be anything other than what I am." He took her hand. "The mountains are beautiful, Judith, but they're cold. You're warm. You're home." That night, as snow fell softly outside and 2 chimneys sent their smoke streaming cleanly into the winter sky, Judith Brennan understood something her father had never put into words. Sometimes the best inventions aren't the ones we build with our hands, but the ones we build with our hearts. Winter finally broke in late March. The morning the first real warmth arrived, children ran through streets that were turning to mud, shouting with joy at being able to play outside without freezing. But before the town could fully celebrate, Pastor Williams called one final gathering. "We came close to tragedy this winter," he announced to the assembled crowd. "Closer than many of you realize. If not for one woman's knowledge and one man's determination to make us listen, we would have lost neighbors, friends, maybe children. We owe them a debt." He gestured for Judith and Orrin to join him at the front. Judith felt every eye in town on her and wanted to sink through the floor, but Orrin's hand on her back steadied her. "Miss Brennan," Pastor Williams continued, "on behalf of Timber Hollow, I want to thank you, not just for the work you did, but for the grace you showed in doing it despite how poorly we treated you." Marcus Thornfield stood then, his son James, now healthy and vibrant, at his side. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice carrying clearly. "I was cruel to Miss Brennan. I mocked her, belittled her, made her the target of town ridicule. I did this honestly, out of small-minded foolishness, out of my own insecurity, needing someone to feel superior to." The crowd was utterly silent. Miss Brennan could have let my son suffer for that, could have let all of us suffer. Instead, she helped everyone, including those who least deserved her help. He turned to face Judith directly. "I'm sorry, truly, deeply sorry. And to make some small amends, I've commissioned a sign for the north entrance of town." He nodded to his men, who unveiled a beautifully carved wooden sign, "Timber Hollow, home of the Brennan Blackwood ventilation system, where innovation saved lives. Winter, 1847 to 1848. Furthermore," Marcus continued, "I've established a fund to help any town within 100 miles that wants to learn these methods. Miss Brennan and Mr. Blackwood will be paid consultants if they're willing." Judith felt tears prickling her eyes. It wasn't just the recognition, it was the transformation. The same people who'd laughed at her now applauded. The same town that had made her feel worthless now literally carved her name into their entrance. But more than that, it was proof of something her father had always believed. Good work, honest work done with love and care eventually speaks for itself. "There's one more thing," Orrin said, surprising everyone by speaking publicly, something the mountain man rarely did. He turned to Judith, and she saw nervousness in his eyes, which somehow made him even more dear to her. "Judith Brennan, this winter you saved a town, but more importantly, you saved me. From loneliness, from a life half-lived in the shadows of mountains. You showed me that the best view isn't from a peak, it's looking into the eyes of someone who sees your soul." He took her hand. "I'm not fancy with words, and I don't have much to offer except hard work and a heart that's completely yours. But I'm asking, here in front of everyone, if you'd marry me." The crowd erupted before Judith could even answer. Women were dabbing their eyes. Men were grinning. Little James Thornfield was literally jumping up and down with excitement. Judith looked at Orrin, this man who'd seen value in her when no one else had, who'd stood beside her through exhausting days and freezing nights, who'd chosen her over his beloved solitude. She thought of her father, who'd have loved Orrin, who'd have been so proud of what she'd accomplished. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The workshop behind their expanded cabin was full of plans and models. Judith, now Judith Blackwood, sat at the drafting table her husband had built her, working on a design for a new client, a mining town in the next territory that had heard of her work. Their business had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. They'd helped redesign ventilation systems in 12 towns, trained local builders in the principles, even been invited to speak at a territorial builders conference. Judith's father's sketches, carefully preserved and expanded upon, were becoming the foundation of a new approach to heating and ventilation across the frontier. But her favorite project was the smallest and most personal. She looked over at the crib in the corner of the workshop, where their daughter, Anna, named for Judith's mother, slept peacefully. The baby was barely 3 months old, with Oren's dark hair and, they suspected, Judith's curious mind. Already she seemed fascinated by firelight, watching the flames with intense concentration. "Gonna be an engineer like her mama," Oren said, entering with firewood. He kissed Judith's head, then peered at the baby. "Or a mountain woman like her papa." "Or both," Judith suggested, smiling. They'd built a larger house now, one that incorporated everything Judith had learned about proper ventilation, with, yes, 2 chimneys, but sophisticated ones, designed rather than improvised. It had become something of a tourist attraction, people coming from surrounding areas just to see the house that started it all. But Judith's favorite spot remained that original cabin they'd kept and converted into their workshop. The 2 crooked chimneys her inexperienced hands had built still stood, still worked perfectly. They were a reminder of where she'd started, alone, mocked, but determined. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Emma Thornfield, now Emma Peterson, having married the general store owner's son, stood there with her own baby on her hip. "Thought I'd bring some stew," Emma said, "and to ask if you'd look at our chimney before next winter. Something's not drawing quite right." "Of course," Judith said, welcoming her friend inside. Friend, real friend now, the kind who stood by you not because of what you could do for them, but because of who you were. As evening fell over Timber Hollow, smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, all improved, all safer, all testaments to what one woman's knowledge and persistence had accomplished. The town that had mocked her now thrived partly because of her. But more than that, Judith herself thrived. She'd found her calling, her love, her place in a world that had seemed to have no place for her. She'd learned that sometimes the things that make you different, the things people mock and misunderstand, are exactly the things that can save lives, change minds, and build futures. Oren came to stand beside her as she looked out at the town, Anna now awake in his arms. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," Judith said slowly, "that my father was right. About the chimneys, yes, but about something bigger too. He always said that the best solutions come from seeing problems differently than everyone else, from being willing to try something that looks foolish to people who aren't really looking. Wise man, your father. And I'm thinking," she continued, leaning into her husband's warmth, "that being different isn't something to hide or be ashamed of. It's something to build on, literally, in my case." They laughed together, the sound mixing with their daughter's happy coos and the evening sounds of Timber Hollow, a town saved by 2 chimneys, transformed by one woman's knowledge, and forever changed by the simple truth that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. That night, as fires were lit across the valley and smoke rose cleanly into the darkening sky, Judith Brennan Blackwood sat at her drafting table with her family around her, working on designs that would help people she'd never meet survive winters she'd never see. And she thought of her father's words one more time. "Let your work speak for itself, Judy girl." It had, and it had said everything that needed saying.